NATO leaders are in Washington for a 3 day summit that started yesterday, that is June 9, to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the alliance. While NATO members will no doubt celebrate its 75th year, others around the world will question its credibility and if it is as positive as projected by the West. How relevant is NATO in today's world? Should the military alliance continue to exist? To discuss these and other questions as part of the Federal's Worldly Wise program, I have with me K.S. Dakshinamurthy, the Federal's managing editor who also follows international politics closely. My first question to you is, how relevant is NATO in today's world?
See, NATO is fundamentally a military alliance that emerged from the Second World War. After the Second World War, you had the Soviet bloc and the US bloc. And then, so NATO came about as a grouping to protect Western interests. And there was a similar grouping which was led by the Soviet Union called the Warsaw Pact. So the Warsaw Pact was led by the Soviet Union, and you had NATO that was backed by the United States. So fundamentally, this is the shortest, briefest history to the emergence of the NATO. Now the point here is in 1990, 1989, 1990, after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, for all practical purposes, the Warsaw Pact didn't exist anymore along with the Soviet Union. But the NATO has continued. Now, the question really is a military alliance that was meant to protect Western interests in the face of Soviet aggression, potential Soviet aggression. Should it still continue when there is no more Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact does not exist? So, it's a question that we need to really look at. And for all practical purposes, today, since the Soviet Union doesn't exist, the international order has changed quite dramatically over the last 35 years. I think it's really time that the NATO looks within and asks the question whether it is really necessary or not to remain. And the other point here is whether NATO, the original purpose of NATO, does it still hold good? So these are the questions we need to look at.
And in your opinion, has NATO's influence on global politics and security been more beneficial or detrimental over the years? Is it a positive or negative force for the world?
So what has happened is that now that the Warsaw Pact ceased to exist and NATO continued as a military alliance, please remember that NATO, when it first started in 1949, there were 12 countries, and today you have 32 countries, which means it has expanded by 20 more countries. And see, NATO is not like any other peacetime grouping. NATO is actually a military alliance. So what it basically means is that the entire NATO infrastructure will come in and protect that particular country. So it's a very large
Attack
active
on one country
military.
is attack on all member countries.
Exactly. So that is how it works. So the point here is now what has happened since then is that NATO has become a reflection of the United States power as a sole superpower or hyperpower, as you may call it, because at the end of the Cold War, with the disintegration of the Soviet Union, only the United States remained, and the US is the sole superpower, and the NATO is the baby of the United States. So it's a reflection of the power which the US has over the world. In fact, the war that is going on today between Ukraine and Russia is a direct result of NATO aggression. Now, you may ask the question: how is it? What is the aggression that NATO indulged in? If you if you see this after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, many countries that were erstwhile part of the Soviet Union and which were allied to the Soviet Union have all become members of NATO. So Russia, which is the core province of the erstwhile Soviet Union, and today which is attempting to regain its old power, feels threatened. It feels threatened, and NATO is even come close to its borders. For instance, if you take Ukraine, Ukraine borders Russia, and when NATO comes so close, it definitely threatens Russia. And so Putin had, you may call it apologetic, but Putin felt that he had no other option but to go on the offensive. And before Ukraine could join NATO, Putin went and attacked, invaded Ukraine, which is unfortunate. I mean, so NATO has in fact triggered a conflict. It has triggered a war, and it's not like NATO completely controls all the narrative. It's not that NATO is so powerful it can do whatever it wants in this world. Please remember, a few years ago, just a couple of years ago, you had the US and NATO running away from Afghanistan after occupying it for 20 years. The same US and NATO was unable to hold on to Afghanistan. So it's not like they're so powerful they can do whatever they want. And even in the case of the war, the Ukraine Russia war, NATO is caught in a jam because NATO would like Ukraine. At the same time, Ukraine is also putting pressure on NATO to take it as a member, but NATO doesn't want to do that because Russia is at war with Ukraine, and by chance Ukraine joins NATO, then NATO will have to fight Russia, which they're not sure, which they don't want. So you see, it also turns out that NATO is quite opportunistic in its approach, and it's very its motives are suspect.
Do you believe NATO has outlived its utility?
Exactly. So that's exactly the point. NATO was relevant for the West at one point of time, and there was enough justification for it because it was banded as a group that had to combat the Warsaw Pact countries led by the Soviet Union. Once the Warsaw Pact countries disappeared, there is no reason for NATO to be around. And not only is NATO around, and as I told you before, it is expanding, and it is expanding, and it is threatening everyone who doesn't toe the line of NATO. Today, NATO is threatened Russia, and you have the war. Tomorrow, it might threaten China because China also continues to be has become a big power in the last 75 years. When the time NATO has existed, China has become a big power, and China, the US sees in fact China as a bigger threat than even Russia. So NATO at some point can even take on China. So then you can imagine the kind of the consequences. And India today, which is it's kind of doing a balancing act between Russia, China, and the NATO countries. At some point, India too will have to face the pressure from NATO. So NATO, ideally speaking, must shut shop. Otherwise, it's going to cause even more damage than what we are seeing today in this Ukraine war.
My last question is, with ongoing debates about the relevance and effectiveness of NATO, do you believe that NATO should actually wind up?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. It's when something has outlived its utility, then the next best thing is to close shop and then look at something else which is really more of a peaceful cooperation, and also recognize the fact that we live today in a unipolar world, but that the unipolarity is also getting diluted because the United States itself is facing a crisis at several levels, even internal crisis. Like the attack on the Capitol Hill by the former President Donald Trump, etc., etc. And there is polarization happening within the United States. There are issues between Europe and the US, and even within the NATO groupings, there are differences. For instance, Hungary, the Hungarian President Viktor Orban, he actually visited Moscow, and he has so far refused to openly condemn Russia for the attack on Ukraine, though he's part of NATO. So you see that there are differences which are growing within NATO. Okay, so it's going to cause more complications for NATO itself, and before it kind of collapses at some point in time, it's better that they honorably cease to exist.
Thank you. Thank you for your time, sir. Viewers, for more such updates and for more such analytical news, please follow the Federal.